Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier with a presentation on the Berlin Blockade. Now, what happened in Berlin in 1948 and 1949 can be seen in a number of ways. It is the last factor in explaining the cause of the Cold War. But at the same time, it is the first act of the Cold War, the first clash between the two superpowers. And it also demonstrates just how Berlin was at the centre of the Cold War. So it's very important. For the context to the crisis, you can go back to the desperate state of the Soviet Union after its losses in World War II, the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, and how each side wanted to deal with Germany. Both sides had broken what had been agreed at Yalta and Potsdam. The West could argue that they had been forced to act the way they did, but the Soviet Union could say the West had acted provocatively. It could also be argued that such were the complexities and emotive issues surrounding what to do about Germany that the agreements made with the war in Europe hardly over were always going to be very difficult to keep. You won't be able to provide too much detail to the context, or you won't have time to focus on the immediate factors. But it's good to be aware of it, and you might refer to it. And I won't have the time to add detail to my overview. Go to my ebooks on Amazon for detail. But the powers were unable to come together and make decisions through the Allied Control Council that they'd set up, nor treat Germany as a single economic unit. And it came to a head when America stopped the delivery of reparations in kind to the Soviet zone. And on January the 1st, 1947, the American and British zones merged into a single economic unit, Bizonia, the French zone merging with them in June 1948, causing a rename, Trizonia. At the same time, a new currency, the Deutschmark, replaced the Reichsmark. The Americans also decided to make martial aid available to the Western zone. That led Stalin, who didn't like the Western presence in Berlin, deep in the Soviet zone, where they not only were a very visible showcase for capitalism, but were able to observe Soviet activity, to try to force them out. And when the currency reform was extended to West Berlin, the Soviet zone quickly responded. As Berlin was so deep in the Soviet zone, it depended on road, rail and canal links that went through the Soviet zone, and so were controlled by Soviet troops. Stalin closed these links. He also cut off all coal, gas and electricity supplies from East Berlin, and the city was surrounded by Soviet troops. The Berlin Blockade had begun. Stalin thought this would force the Western powers out of Berlin, but Truman was determined that West Berlin should remain as a beacon of freedom in the heartland of the Soviet zone and of Eastern Europe as a whole, as well as a centre for espionage. To give in would also make the Truman Doctrine seem a rather empty statement of intent. If this was a test of their resolve, they were determined to meet it. West Berlin needed everything: food, coal, gas and electricity. Vital, not for the luxuries of life, but for survival. Stalin's advisors thought that West Berlin would not be able to hold out for more than 4 to 6 weeks. But to force their way through the blockade, which was an option, would risk war, so the Allies opted to supply West Berlin by air. It was an enormous task, but the onus was now on Stalin. If he shot down the planes, he would be risking war. He didn't, but the Soviet Union made things as difficult as possible. Soviet planes flew over the air corridor, and weather balloons were positioned so as to get in the way. The radios of the Allied planes were jammed, and at night searchlights would shine in the pilots' faces. There were crashes, and some pilots were killed, but Stalin made sure that the provocation wasn't enough to lead to war. For 11 months the planes flew day and night. West Berlin suffered from shortages, especially through the winter of 1948-1949, but it was not as cold as it might have been. Food was rationed. Petrol too. Gas and electricity were restricted to just 2 hours per day at the peak of the blockade, and the trams and the trains stopped running. The Soviet Union offered incentives for West Berliners to move to East Berlin, but only 3% of the population took up the offer. And West Berlin survived. In May 1949, the blockade was ended. Stalin reopened the land links. The West had been tested, but had won the first conflict of the Cold War. Truman saw it as a personal test that he had passed. Its consequences, though, were deep and long-lasting. Germany was permanently divided, at least as far as anyone at the time could foresee. In May 1949, the Western zones became the Federal Republic of Germany, known as West Germany. In October 1949, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, or East Germany, and East Berlin was made its capital. Also, as I've said, Berlin was now firmly fixed as the epicenter of the Cold War. For America, West Berlin would be the symbol of everything the West stood for: freedom and prosperity. For the Soviet Union, it would be an irritant, provoking unrest at times. Both sides had risked war, and at the height of the crisis, the Western powers met in Washington and signed an agreement that led in April 1949 to the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a European initiative, but one which the Americans led, the first military alliance America had ever joined in peacetime. An anti-communist, anti-Soviet Union alliance. It was a result of the Berlin Blockade, but it was also a result of the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, of Cominform, and even of Comecon. In May 1955, West Germany joined, rearming in the process, though not as a nuclear power. As a direct response to West Germany rearming and joining NATO, in May 1955, the 8 countries of the Soviet bloc formed their own defensive military alliance, under the firm control of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. Their enemy, the NATO countries. So, a brief overview of the causes, the dangers, and the consequences of the Berlin Blockade. Now I have a podcast, making sense of this crazy world, with some episodes on the Cold War, which might interest you. You'll find it on the usual sites for podcasts. But for now, I will simply thank you for listening and wish you the best of luck with your studies. Cheers.